Hi, Tim. Nice of you to join today. That's great. And for agreeing to be interviewed on reincarnation. So my first question is always maybe a silly one, but do you believe in reincarnation?
Absolutely. And not only that, I believe that death, as most people understand it, is a complete myth and a complete fallacy. And most people's views on death, particularly materialistic people, their view doesn't make any logical sense at all if we believe that we are spiritual beings.
And why do you believe this? Is it only a logical conclusion that you believe in reincarnation, or have you had any personal experience as well?
Yes, I've had many personal experiences, and I think that a lot of people now are reaching a kind of intuitive understanding of what this is about, something which bypasses the logical mind, which bypasses the normal intellectual processes, but a deeper inner conviction. This happened to me when I was extremely young. I was about 8 years old and I was playing football in the playground with the other boys, and suddenly I just walked over to one of the walls at the far end of the playground. And I had this experience, and I just was convinced, absolutely convinced, that I'd been here before. I don't mean in that particular playground, but that I'd been on this earth. And not only that, I also had a conviction at the same time that I was here for a particular purpose in this life. Now, that's quite unusual, I think, for an 8-year-old to experience that, even though I'd been brought up in a conventional, although not very devout, Christian family. Everything that my teachers and the priest at the church said, everything my parents said, didn't make any sense at all. But somehow I knew that they were wrong and I was right. And this feeling stayed with me throughout my life. And this prompted really a lifelong search to understand what death, the after-death state, and reincarnation is all about. And of course, once you get into this, you have to start exploring the twin law of karma, the law of cause and effect, because this is so deeply intertwined with rebirth that without it, rebirth makes no sense. So this set off a lifelong search to try and discover some of the answers about this. And later in life, I got into theosophy, but I'd studied many, many other traditions and religious and spiritual practices throughout history, throughout my life.
Thank you. And if we rewind back to this event when you were 8 years old or 10 years old, 8 years old,
8 years old.
on the football pitch, was there anything, was it the location where you were that you remembered it, or was it something, a movement or an interaction with people that made you remember? Was it any kind of trigger for you to all of a sudden have this experience?
There was no kind of trigger that I've ever been able to identify. It just happened absolutely spontaneously. And as far as I'm aware, it wasn't triggered by anything anybody said, by the location, by the weather, by anything else. It just simply came over me. But it was so strong that to pull an 8-year-old boy off a football pitch, I mean, when nothing is more important than that, it must have been something quite deep and significant for me.
Absolutely, yeah. And have you had any other experiences regarding your personal past lives? Any memories, maybe?
Yes, I have. And this really falls into two categories. There are the memories which I'll shortly explain to you about my uncle. And also, I underwent a series of 4 hypnotic regression sessions about 15 years ago, in which a number of past lives, probably about 7 or 8, going back. The earliest one was 2000 BC in the Middle East. And there were others in the Middle Ages, in the Victorian period. And there was a recent one in the 20th century. But when I checked this out later on, there was absolutely no evidence for this particular individual who I identified in this particular session. So I don't know what was going on there, whether it was some sort of conflated memory, whether under these conditions people are actually not having memories about themselves, but are somehow tapping into the astral light or the Akashic records, that permanent and indelible record of everything that's ever been done and said and felt in the world. Are people somehow tapping into that? I don't know. Some of these personalities that were identified were extremely vivid and had an extreme degree of resonance with me. One in particular was during the 11th or 12th century, and I was this monk come messenger, come secret agent, ferrying secret documents between monasteries. I've no idea what was in these documents, but this man was called Brother Amos, and he seems to have been like a mixture between James Bond and some traveling friar. And that was quite interesting. And I did feel a deep kind of connection to this. And I had a great sense of belief in it, perhaps more than some of the other ones. Mm-hmm. So there was that, and I remain very open-minded about the value of these hypnotic regression sessions. I do know from my research that they have an enormous therapeutic benefit for many people, because quite clearly, if we subscribe to the law of karma and rebirth, then we're going to come into this life with certain conditions, and also the possibility of having to interact with other people. And therefore, you know, it's always very difficult to understand one's karma if we don't know about our past lives. But then, of course, there is a very good reason why we don't remember past lives, particularly when we're not at a very high stage of development. If we were aware of everything that we've done in these past lives, and some of it is going to be really horrible and brutal, we will have killed and maimed people, we will have stolen, we will have done all sorts of things. And if we were to carry all that into our present life, it would drive us crazy. We wouldn't be able to operate. And this is why many religious and spiritual traditions talk about this idea of forgetfulness when you come into incarnation, crossing the river Lethe and various other things to do with that. And besides, even in this life, most of us can't remember what we were doing 2 years last Tuesday unless we consult our diaries. So I think that the fact that we simply can't remember these things usually is not necessarily a bad thing, because otherwise we would be burdened. We're told that when we do reach a certain stage of development, we will see all our lives as one, and we won't basically differentiate between them. We will simply see it as one life going via different personalities, spending time in the after-death states. So life continues in and out of the body. The other thing which has always interested me a great deal is from my own personal experience. And this goes back probably even before the age of 8. I grew up in the 1950s and in a working class community in Bradford. And we were the first people to buy a television in the street. And I think we bought it for the Queen's coronation in 1953, because one of my earliest memories is the house full of people watching the coronation procession through London. But at this time, they were making quite a lot of war films. And I used to love these films. And I always watched them. And my parents took me to the cinema as well. And I loved these kind of black and white films, you know, showing us beating the Germans and all this sort of stuff. And I felt that I'd been there. And then one day they showed one of the many films they made about the North African campaign in late 1941 through to 1943, when the Allies were fighting the Afrika Korps in Libya and Egypt and various other places. My uncle, Joseph, Joe, he was killed in this campaign on the 2nd of April, 1942. I've never been able to identify fully how he died, because there was certainly no major battle on that day as far as I've been able to establish. but he was killed. And when I started to look at these war films, particularly the desert ones, I had this absolute feeling that I'd somehow played a part in this. And this feeling just got stronger and stronger the more of these films that I actually saw. And then when I was still quite young, 7 or 8, I had a dream in which I was hovering above the desert, watching a body being loaded into the back of an ambulance underneath a blanket on a stretcher. And that was me. And I was very, very convinced in this dream. And as I got older and started to think more and more about this, I somehow started to wonder whether I might not have been Joseph and had come back, as many people seem to do after wars, because wars particularly claim the lives of young men who are 18, 19, 20, 21. And it would make sense for them to want to get back into incarnation very, very quickly, which is why you always see a baby boom after wars. But what makes the story particularly interesting and perhaps a little unusual is that Joseph, wasn't my real uncle because I was adopted. I was adopted by a couple called George and Edith Wyatt, who were in their late 30s and never had been able to have children themselves. And so I was adopted in October 1952 when I was 6 weeks old. And it struck me, particularly when I started to investigate this idea of people coming back in soul groups, people who somehow are obliged to fulfill a karmic script with each other. And this idea comes up again and again, that the same groups of people incarnate in different personalities in order to play out karmic obligations which they have developed in previous lives. And over many years, I started to think about this. It made me think that somehow circumstances had maybe conspired so that I could fulfill something with my father. What makes this is not particularly relevant, but it's also quite interesting because my father was also a sergeant in the army. And there was a third brother called Jack. Now, Jack and Joseph had signed up for the army in the early 1930s during the Great Depression because there was no work. And they both became sergeants in the 1st Battalion of the Worcestershire Regiment. Joseph was killed in 1942. Jack survived 15 years in the army. And then 2 or 3 days after he was discharged, he was run over by a doctor in a town in North Wales and killed instantly. It turns out that the doctor had been carrying bottles of chloroform in the back of his car. One of these, the stoppers had come loose. He'd gone to sleep at the wheel and smashed into my uncle in the front of a shop in Wales. So all this, you could say it's all imagination, but to me, there is a deep inner conviction that there is something about this story which is true. I might not have got all the facts absolutely right, but I do think it adds evidence in particular for this idea that the same people incarnate together time after time in different relationships. In one life, I'm your sister. The next, I'm your worst enemy. Next, I'm a business partner. Then I'm your father. Then I'm your close cousin. It could be many, many different things. And you could almost look on it as we can look on each individual life as being like a repertory theatre. In one life, you're playing King Lear. In the next one, you're playing Richard III, and so on. We all adopt these very, very different personalities for each life to suit the task that we've set ourselves, and also as a suitable vehicle to play out the karma that we have accrued in previous lives, because that's one of the reasons we're here. And it should be said that karma is something which is extremely simple to understand on the one hand, but it's extremely complex to work it out, especially when it comes to things like collective or group karma, which involves the karma of all those involved in a country or a war or an organization or a family or a nation or whatever. But I do think it's very, very interesting the way that we do play these different roles. And the idea is that we have to experience as many different things as possible in lives in order to complete our experience and accelerate, hopefully, our own evolution. So while karma is very, very easy to understand, it's often misunderstood. For example, people talk about good karma and bad karma. And these are purely relative terms, because if someone bashes you over the head in this life, it may be the very best thing which has to happen to you. And if we put off things in this life, if we put off the lessons and the experiences, it simply means that they get deferred to a future time when they might be visited on us in an even more severe way. So understanding what this is all about doesn't give us absolute control over it, but it does give us a greater degree of control of how we deal with the problems in our life. And, you know, we should cherish problems. I know it's hard to say, but we should cherish problems because they're there as lessons. And as the writer Eckhart Tolle says, suffering is most people's only spiritual teacher. And I think those are very, very wise words indeed. So if we shirk our responsibilities and if we duck from problems and if we imagine life is going to be nice all the time, then we're very mistaken. And also by the same token, if we are somehow trying to create an equilibrium and rebalance the disharmony from past lives, by the same token, we can also start to modify our behavior now so that in future lives, we're not building up as much nasty karma, if we might call it that, as we might have done before when we were ignorant. And we can learn to control our thoughts and words and deeds to a much greater degree because we know these things all leave an imprint. They all send out vibrations, good or bad or ugly or indifferent, but they send out vibrations and those will come back to us at some point.
So that's also karma. Karma is not only physical action, but it's also what we think, our vibrations, all this. All this has an impact as well on what's going to happen to us, basically. Is this what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, I think a large proportion, I wouldn't like to say what, but a huge proportion of disease, especially mental disease, I think has karmic roots to it. Because despite what the doctors tell us, disease doesn't start on the physical level. That's where it manifests, but disease starts on much more subtle levels, such as the mental level, and also in particular, the astral level. Writers like Alice Bailey write a lot about this, and I think she says something like 3/4 of diseases would originate on the mental or astral planes. And when we look around the world today and we see the large amount of people who suffer from mental disorders of one kind or another, and in particular, depression and anxiety, and especially at the time we're talking in late 2020, when this pandemic is sweeping around the world, then, you know, I think it's quite significant to look on things in this particular way.
Yeah, thank you for that. What I found interesting about your personal story is that who are the real parents? You know, you have biological parents, and but you didn't live with them, you didn't grow up with them, and then two people adopted you, a couple, and they were your adoptive parents, but maybe they were your real family because you think you have an incarnation in that biological family, which is so interesting that the biology doesn't actually mean so much, you know. So it's a very interesting story that it all comes together as it should be in the end. So it's all meant to be. It was exactly meant to be like that, you know. That's the feeling I'm getting from that.
Well, it could be that there were links to both families and there was something to be discharged here. And of course, this raises another very interesting point here. You know, we say in the English language, oh, you can't choose your parents. But that's exactly what we do. We do choose our parents. We do choose where, when, and how we're going to be born, particularly when we've reached a certain stage of development, perhaps people who are still spiritually very immature do require some sort of guidance on the inner planes as to the circumstances of their birth. But it's said that as we become more developed and more mature, we take much greater control in choosing the best parents, the best environment, the best social economic group to be born into, the best country to be born into for our own particular needs. And so I do think there is a degree of control over this. How much control, I don't know, because this is something we can debate endlessly about. If we come into life with karma, and if we believe in astrology and that the time and place of our birth somehow sets a template for our life, and I do believe that, how much free will do we have? Do we have any free will at all? This is a very, very interesting question, and it can't be answered very easily, I don't think.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I have also a question regarding the nations we were born. All your reincarnations that you remember, either directly or through past life regression, were they in the same country or in different countries?
Many different countries, many different countries. They included France, England, what is now Lebanon, although I'm not sure what it was called in 2000 BC because it was part of many, many different empires. A lot of the incarnations certainly were in England. But then one of the other pieces of, quote, evidence for reincarnation is when you go somewhere and you feel a special rapport with that particular place. And there are cases of people going to strange cities for the first time and knowing everything about these cities, where this particular shop is, where that monument is, where that street leads. Even though they've never been there, they seem to have been there before in some ways. Now, I've been to a number of places in the world. I've traveled quite widely when I was a journalist, been to a great many different places, both as a tourist and working as well. And occasionally I do get a sense of rapport with the place. And most recently, over the last 2 years, I've been visiting Greece quite widely, or at least when I can, when there aren't any restrictions on. And I feel an incredible empathy with that country. And I've been to a number of the sacred sites there, such as the Oracle at Delphi, Old Olympia, and many other places. And the more I go to these places, the more I feel that I was there at some point in the past. I can just feel it within me. So I think places, rapport with places, an understanding of places, when something sets up a vibrational harmony with you, you recognize that in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. Any other places apart from Greece that you remember, or that triggered something where you had like a déjà vu maybe?
Well, I'm not sure if this particularly fits into this category, but I had a very profound experience in 1995. It was the middle of June 1995, and I'd been filming the TT races and making a couple of short documentaries on the Isle of Man when I was working for independent television. And at this point, my life had kind of reached this absolute climax. My career was very good. My relationship was okay. I had a young daughter, and everything seemed to be working very well. And we were in the churchyard early one Sunday afternoon, and the cameraman had just gone off to get some general shots of Celtic gravestones and ivy and graveyard type shots to illustrate a particular film we were making. And I was just sitting by the side of the church, and there was this man with his hand against this giant leaning stone. The stone was huge, about 15 feet tall, and he was just standing there with his hand against it. And he was there for quite a few minutes, and eventually, having nothing better to do, I walked over to him and said, what are you doing? And he just looked at me and he said, I'm just getting the vibrations from this stone. Now, a lot of journalists are very cynical and hard-nosed about this sort of stuff, but I wasn't. And he said, why don't you try putting your hand on this stone? And I did. And immediately it was like some incredibly powerful energy just shot straight up my spine, the way they often talk about things like Kundalini. And I almost had a kind of out of the body experience. I could almost see myself doing this. But something profoundly changed in my life at that point. And I knew that I'd reached the high point of the cycle and that a decline was going to set in. In the next 2 years, everything fell apart. You know, I'd gone from living in this really nice luxury flat. I was out of work. My parents had died. And I was reduced to living in this horrible small room in Manchester. And at the time, I was just very, very, very angry about all this, and I didn't really understand it. But after a while, when I began to calm down about it, and I started rereading a lot of the esoteric stuff, I began to get an understanding of why this had happened to me, because I had been on the wrong path. I'd had to do what I'd had to do, but that had to come to an end because there was other work now to do. And slowly, as the years developed, this work became more and more important to me. I still worked as a journalist and as a freelance, but I started writing and researching and doing various other activities to further these ideas. So this was a very, very profound moment. It was almost like being reincarnated, but in the same life.
It feels like the program was started, was triggered. You know, the program why you were really here in this lifetime. You know, you've come to a peak in your material life, and then there was this trigger point so that you kind of would get back onto track, so to speak.
Precisely, yeah.
Yeah, wow, so cool. And you said you remembered places. Have you ever remembered another person? You saw them and you think you know them, and there might actually be memories already all there, or maybe just a feeling that you know of that person?
Well, for many years, I've always felt that the people that I've been closest to, and some of the people that I've had the most severe difficulties with, I've often felt that we must be playing something out which started in another life. So I don't have any specific memories of close friends or partners or anything like that in specific roles in other lives. But I do accept the fact that they will have been there in some shape or form, but nothing specific, no.
Okay. And have you ever been a woman? Have you got any recollection or any feeling that you've been a woman?
Yes, I have. When I went through the hypnotic regression sessions, 2 of the incarnations had been as women. One of them can be dated quite precisely because this woman was married to a novelist in Paris, and outside the window of their apartment, the Eiffel Tower was being built. So you can precisely date that. And this woman was very, very frustrated because her husband was this very well-known novelist. But the problem was she felt that she could write better than he could. And she was prevented from doing so because of the social circumstances of the time. And so that was a very, very frustrating experience. The other experience of a woman was probably sometime in around the 12th century, during the time of one of the Crusades. And she was a titled lady, and her husband was off fighting in one of these conflicts. And she loved him very, very much indeed. And she just couldn't bear to be apart from him. And I think she died of something like a broken heart, literally. But just on this question, people, when I started researching this business about which sex we come into life with, there are a number of different interesting variants of this. Some people say we come in alternatively as a man and a woman. Rudolf Steiner, for example, says that we incarnate twice during each major age. Each of these ages is 2,150 years, making the precession of the equinoxes, which takes 25,940 40 years. So every 2,100 years, Steiner says we're born twice. We have two incarnations, one as a man, one as a woman. Many other esoteric writers have said that we have a succession of lives in one particular gender, up to perhaps a maximum of 6 or 7, and then we change to the opposite gender. This, of course, could explain why many people feel uncomfortable with the gender that they're assigned to. And it could also explain many other things as well. But I don't know. I mean, I've no idea as to whether it's an alternation or not, but it is certainly worth thinking about. I would have thought that we come into a life and take the gender that's most suitable to what we need to achieve in that life. But we must also remember that men's and women's roles have changed so much over the last 50 and 100 years that they're absolutely unrecognizable now. I mean, let's not forget that women only got the vote 100 years ago in the UK, and then not even all women. It was only 90 years ago that all women got the vote in the UK. And, you know, even when I grew up, the attitudes between men and women, when you look at them then, I mean, people would be horrified now. And that was only 50, 60 years ago. Mm-hmm. So there has been a huge change, and it may be that this is also part of some greater plan, which I don't pretend to understand.
Yeah. I mean, in the articles you sent me, you mentioned the search for Bridey Murphy, yeah, and there was also a film made of it. So I watched the film in the last few days, and it was very interesting. But it was, of course, made for Hollywood as well. But I noticed also the attitude for the women in this film. She always asked her husband whether it was okay that she got hypnotically regressed, and always waited for his permission. I just thought it was a really different time then. And anyway, just came up when I saw this. Yeah. So yeah.
It's often said that Bridey Murphy film was absolutely crucial. It was made in the early 1950s. I forget which year, 56, 57. Her book came out a couple of years before. But people do say it was one of the great stimulants for research into reincarnation. It created a huge upsurge of both popular and academic interest. So as well as being just a bit of entertainment or a best-selling book, it also had another function of opening up this area for research and discussion.
Absolutely, and that's why I think it was good. It was a Hollywood movie, so many people would see it, and there was a bit of a warning at the end as well. Just don't play with it just for the sake of it. In a way, that's how it ended. Otherwise, you get stuck somewhere, or it confuses you, basically, which I thought was interesting. Okay, and you also mentioned the time in between lifetimes, and I know there are different theories. Theosophists think it takes like a long time between two lifetimes. Something when someone dies in the war, they get reborn quickly. Some think as soon as you leave the body, you get a new one, pretty much. What is your what conclusion have you come through? I'm sure you've studied all these different theories, but you know, they even contradict each other. So which one have you settled with now for yourself?
Well, I wouldn't say that I've settled with any one theory, but I have concocted an eclectic view of what I think happens. And certainly people like Madame Blavatsky, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society, and others, they talked about people being out of incarnation for up to 1,500 years for the average person, a bit less for other people. And I think that I don't think it's arbitrary at all like this, because the number of people coming into incarnation and the time between lives, I think, is very dependent on the particular cycle that we happen to be in, on the one hand. The second factor is our own personal needs as to how long we need to spend out of a body. Now, if you are a very materialistic person, if you're greedy, selfish, mean, without a spiritual bone in your body, you're not going to spend very long out of incarnation because there is no need to. The purpose of these afterlife states, which are basically two, first the astral world, the desire world, and later the mental world or the heaven world, are the two principal stages that we go through according to theosophy. So someone who is just very brutal and materialistic and not spiritual at all will spend some time on the astral plane. That's said to be typically about a third of one's life. So if most people live to 75 or so, you would spend the equivalent of 25 years on the astral plane. Although on these planes, time doesn't exist. Time is only a construct of the physical world. The second port of call, according to theosophy, is basically what they call Devachan, the land of the gods, the Christian heaven, the mental world. Now, if you have had intellectual capacities, or even if you have been just crudely religious, but have had some kind of spiritual or intellectual leanings, then this is the place where you go in order for these to be refined. Just as the astral world is a place of purification, almost like the Christian purgatory, where the more unpleasant aspects are gradually filtered out and the good parts synthesized into something which can be renewed in a future life. This is also what happens in the mental world. And if you don't have any particularly strong spiritual or mental feelings, why would you go there? And so therefore, the more developed you become, up to a certain point, the longer you're going to spend probably out of physical existence. Although there will be many variations to this, depending on the cycles and necessities of a particular time, and depending upon your own personal evolutionary requirements.
Yeah, okay, so that's the theosophical model. You also, that makes sense to you, because in your articles you mentioned Alice Bailey, who almost thinks the opposite, that if the more spiritual you are, that's how I understood it from your article, the more quickly you get born, almost, because you don't need to, you can just go straight to the next life. You know, that's another way of looking at it.
Well, I think that's when you become super evolved, when you're almost reaching adept status,
right.
and you're reaching a time where perhaps you're in your last 1, 2, or 3 incarnations in a physical body before graduating to the next evolutionary strand, the superhuman kingdoms, the land of the gods, the angels, the devas, and all these different words that people use to describe this. So I think up to yes, when you are evolving, you will spend longer and longer, but you then will reach a point where, yes, you don't need this anymore, because your time being spent in physical bodies is going to be limited, because you're destined for higher things eventually.
Yeah. Good. And which of your, oh yeah, I had a question about, you said you had several past life regressions, and there's a memory of this Joseph William Wyatt, or maybe Jack, that you might have been. Now, this memory, does it come from a past life regression, or is it independent?
Oh, this is entirely independent of any past life regression sessions. This feeling in its earliest form came to me when I was very young, and it's strengthened throughout my life as I've been into these things. I'm not saying it's absolutely correct, but to me, it's the best interpretation that I have based on the knowledge that I have. One day, I hope to go to Heliopolis Cemetery in Cairo. And I think when I stand by his grave, I'll know one way or another. I'm hoping to do that sometime next year.
You should, definitely. Yeah. When was the moment, though? I mean, sometimes we get, you said as a boy you watched war films and all these things, so there was a propensity. But when was the moment where you actually thought that could have been me? Maybe that's me or something, because nobody, probably told you this was you, there was some certainty, some feeling came up within you that you thought that might have been me. When and how did this happen? Like an instant, all of a sudden, maybe you looked at a photo and it came to you, the thought, I don't know, or was it a dream, or how did it come to you?
The actual realization that I may have been my uncle only came to me a few years ago, but this had been building for decades, because when I was very young, I had this dream of being killed in the desert and loaded into an ambulance. I'd always been attracted to those war films, especially those that were fought in North Africa, and there were deserts everywhere. And this just increased through my life. And I probably didn't come to this final conclusion until perhaps 8 or 10 years ago.
Right. And have you seen a photo of Joseph or Jack? Have you ever seen them? What they looked like?
There are some pictures somewhere, but I couldn't picture them right now in my mind. There are some old family photographs somewhere, and I think he looked nothing like my father. He was slightly different from the way my father looked. But no, it's not so much about how they looked. It's something much more intangible than that.
No, I'm just asking because that happened to me. I saw a photo, an old photo, and I was in meditation all day, and I was on this kind of altered state a little bit, and I saw this photo, and there was this certainty that was me. I don't know, but it wasn't a rational thing. And since then, when I look now, I'm certain, but I can't prove it. But sometimes that can trigger something. I'm just always interested in the trigger points. Okay. And which past life do you think had the most impact on your life, this current life on you?
Well, I don't particularly, well, it's a question of whether we believe these past life regressions that I underwent 15 years ago. And I have to keep an open mind about those. So I can't say whether they were or whether they weren't, but they were all incredibly vivid. I might have just been concocting them in the hypnotic state, or I might have been accessing something which I wasn't even personally involved in. So I don't know, but clearly the previous life to this one must have had some great significance and bearing on this one. I don't know about any of the others, but this particular incarnation, that the previous one, I certainly was a soldier, and I was certainly in the desert somewhere. I have no doubt about that whatsoever, because otherwise I don't think I would have had such a keen interest. Even now, when these films come on, you know, things like Ice Cold in Alex, which was on, it's on nearly every week. I don't know if you've seen this film, and if you haven't, I thoroughly recommend it. I know it line by line, scene by scene, shot by shot, and it's a fantastic film with John Mills, one of my favorite actors, in it. And it's a very simple film. It's just a few people trying to get through the desert away from the Germans, overcoming various difficulties. When I first saw this film, when I was probably about 8 or 9, that had an incredible impact on me. Also, my father had a book which depicted the North African campaign. And one of the things it showed was, in order to stop the Germans, they built loads and loads of concrete blocks, which were essentially tank traps. And when I was very young and I saw one of these pictures of this long line of blocks through the desert, that sparked something in me. Now, why concrete blocks should have done it, I don't know, but it did.
Unusual, yeah. But everyone has other triggers, and that's always interesting. And what, I mean, the knowledge that reincarnation exists, how has it changed your life, your outlook on life, what you do with your life? If you hadn't known this, how different would your life have been?
If I'd never thought of this, if I'd never entertained the possibility that this might just be one of many lives, I think I would have been like many other people, just very ambitious, very greedy, trying to claw my way up the greasy media pole, trying to get to the top, exercise my ego as much as possible, acquire as many cars, as many houses, and all the rest of it. I think I would have been quite unrestrained. And I think this is why certain events happened in my life to stop that from progressing any further. I think when people do understand that this is one life of many, it's an absolute game changer for people, because it means they know they can't carry on just behaving in a selfish and materialistic way, because it's purposeless to do that. The purpose of life here is to learn lessons, to become educated, to go through experiences, to acquire all sorts of knowledge in different ways, to experience different emotions, to pay off old debts, and to start believing that when we come into our next life, we're a little bit higher up that spiral than we were on this particular life. So if we see it as an evolutionary journey, and we don't just focus on one particular life, but look on our lives as being part of a much larger life, but also a continuation through different physical bodies and through periods of rest in the after-death states, that makes people behave in a very different way. And I don't think it's any accident, the fact that so many more people now believe in some kind of rebirth than they did half a century ago. Because a lot of these spiritual ideas have percolated into mass consciousness, not through mainstream materialistic science, and certainly not through the Western religions, because they don't believe in reincarnation. And this is an interesting point. Had the Christian church not abandoned reincarnation and described it as one of the anathemas at the Council of Constantinople in the mid-6th century, Christianity would have had a profoundly different effect upon the world. And today, I suggest it would be a much more vibrant religion than it actually is. Because a lot of Christians, despite what they're told, believe in rebirth. And when they do surveys into this, they find quite large numbers of people, especially Roman Catholics, and less so amongst the more austere Protestant religions. But nevertheless, some people go against one of the basic tenets of their faith and say, hang on, no, I do believe I'll be born again.
Interesting. I did not know this about Catholics that you mentioned now. I did not know that. Okay. Have you got any evidence, anything from previous lifetimes, any physical things that you saw, any photos or anything like that?
I don't have any particular photographs. As I say, perhaps the most profound things that have happened in this particular area is when I've been to certain places. And one of those places, in fact, was Greece, as I mentioned earlier on.
Yeah. Okay.
Greece had a very, very profound effect on me, especially when I went to the oracle at Delphi.
Right.
And I could actually feel the energies of the place there. And there were plenty of tourists around when I was there. There were always plenty of people walking around, but nevertheless, I could still feel it. And driving through the landscape of Greece with all those olive trees and all those hills and mountains and fields full of vegetables, it was almost as strong as the bond that I feel between myself and where I live here in the north of England. I feel an incredible bond here, incredible relationship to the landscape. And I think Greece is the place that I felt this most strongly.
Right.
There have been places where I felt absolutely repelled to be and didn't like being there at all. And one of those is New York.
Which one? New York?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
right.
I really didn't like New York. It's a long time since I went there. I was filming there back in the late 1980s, and I was there for about a week. And for me, it was just hell on earth. I absolutely hated it.
Right.
And the other place that I can't really stand to go to now, and I'm sorry to say this, is London. I find a great feeling of anxiety and almost repulsion when I go to London. And yet I used to live there. I lived there for 5.5 years in the early 1970s, and literally woke up one morning and decided I can't live here anymore. Now, whether this has got anything to do with reincarnation or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But no, I've never been triggered by any particular photographs, but I have been to certain places where I felt a great affinity. There is a place near where I live, a moor called, well, it's called Ilkley Moor, the popular name for it. And on this moor, there are more standing stones and Neolithic carvings than virtually anywhere else in Europe, possibly apart from Carnac in northern France. And every time I go up there, and particularly to a very small stone circle, which is called the 12 Apostles, when I walk into that stone circle, and it's not very impressive, the stones are only about 3 feet tall, I get an incredible feeling there. And I do get the feeling that I somehow participated in something that took place there or nearby. And this would have been probably something like 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, perhaps 4,000 BC,
Wow.
when most of these stones were carved and some of the small monuments were then erected. But it's very vague. I don't have any specific memories of wearing animal skins and carrying a spear or anything like that.
Yeah.
But I do get the sense of the energy, and I'm very, very sensitive to energies. And this is how I get a lot of my information, not necessarily through visual stimuli or auditory stimuli, but through a feeling of energy in particular places. And this is why I have such a strong liking and aversion to certain places.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Have you got any memory from the state between lives as well, or any inklings?
Well, when I first started rereading a lot of the theosophical stuff 15 or 20 years ago, I started reading the works of Annie Besant and Charles Leadbeater. They were the second generation theosophists who basically simplified a lot of Blavatsky's work and made it much more accessible. I know there are, shall we say, factions within the theosophical movement who don't like Besant and Leadbeater because they interfered with certain of Blavatsky's ideas and they made various assertions which people don't like. But when I was reading, in particular, Besant's books about the astral plane and about the Devachanic or mental plane or the heaven world, whatever you decide to call it, it did produce a feeling within me that this was a familiar place and that this was a kind of, when Besant used the word hall of learning, in one of her books, she talks about the hall of ignorance and the hall of learning and then the hall of something else. This hall of learning became quite a potent phrase in me. And I started getting kind of thoughts of being in like some vast cosmic library somewhere, continuing research. And this is what's said to happen. The fact that writers, artists, philosophers, poets, scientists, architects might actually be going there to give themselves some kind of inspiration for the kind of work that they might do at some point in the future. So these feelings were only very vague, I have to say, but nevertheless, they were very powerful and they had a deep resonance within me.
Do you follow a regular spiritual practice?
Yes, I do. I meditate almost every day. I don't sit cross-legged on the floor because my knees won't take it anymore. But I do close off all external stimuli, perhaps for up to half an hour or sometimes an hour a day. And I have these periods where I just try and switch off my mind. It usually happens mid to late afternoon. And I sometimes go into a situation which is somewhere between waking and sleeping. I'm aware of everything that's going on, but I just completely switch off. And this is a time when I often get my best ideas, and they just come to me because I've switched off the mental plane to some extent. Because the mental plane, as useful as it can be, it can also act as a barrier. Because much of the information that comes to us, I think, comes through a much higher principle, which theosophists call the sixth principle out of seven, what they call the wisdom intuition principle. And this is something which is said is being developed very strongly amongst human beings. It's often said now that many of the children coming into incarnation are much more intuitive, much more empathic than we were at their age. So perhaps this is actually something which is starting to blossom in humanity, that we get knowledge in a kind of a Gnostic way, a direct way, without it being filtered through the logical and intellectual mind. And this is what happens to me during these particular moments, because the value of these moments is the fact that you're in a timeless state, effectively. You're not depressed about all the horrible things that have gone on in the past. You're not anxious about what's going to happen in the future. You're actually living in the now. This is something that Eckhart Tolle talks about. His book is called Living in the Now. And if more people were able to do that, I'm sure that they would be able to access much deeper aspects to themselves. The problem is when people do have intuition, because it sometimes goes against the intellectual mind, people tend to distrust it. And they think, oh, well, there's no logical basis for this, therefore I have to dismiss it. But many people in life, perhaps because of their work, journalists, police officers, and others who deal frequently with a wide section of the public, do get hunches. They are able to read people without that person even saying anything to them. So it's a learnt skill in one sense. And I do think that it's something that people will benefit from greatly. But of course, we put so much emphasis on the mind in the modern world that it's difficult to transcend that. And the other problem here, of course, is that most people think that the mind is centered in the brain, rather than looking on the brain as just being a processor in the physical world for information that's coming from somewhere other than ourselves, somewhere outside ourselves, because the mind is not confined to the brain. And this has been proved on many occasions. I don't know if you've read the book by Dr. Aben Alexander called Proof of Heaven. This is a fascinating book for a number of reasons. Aben Alexander was a top neurosurgeon, an arch skeptic about anything spiritual, absolutely against it all, and had no spiritual traditions attached to him at all. One day he got a severe form of meningitis and went into an absolute coma for 7 days, during which he had a very, very profound series of experiences. What's interesting about this is the fact that as a neurosurgeon, as a neuroscientist, he knew that his brain was simply not functioning then. And yet he'd had all these vivid experiences when his brain was effectively in a dead state. And he came back from all this, wrote a book about it, which became a bestseller. And he was then convinced that, well, no, the mind isn't confined to the brain, because my brain was dead, and yet I went through this vivid journey. He wasn't expected to survive this, but somehow, miraculously, he did. And like many people who go through near-death experiences, they often describe very, very similar things. Going down a tube or a tunnel or a passageway, emerging into the light, being greeted by family members, spiritual beings like Jesus or other spiritual advisors, being led through beautiful scenery until they reach a certain point, like a wall or a river or some other kind of barrier. They are then told, oh, you have to go back, it's not your time to be here, invariably the person who's being led on this journey says, but I don't want to go back, I love it here, this is my home. Sorry, it's your time to go back. But no, I really want to stay here. No, you must go back. And it's very insistent they have to do this. And they wake up in the hospital ward, or they wake up whatever it is, and they are aware of this experience. And so, this is quite interesting, because another of the bits of research which have been done, particularly those people who've investigated life between lives, and a number of researchers have tried to do this. And one of the things that's frequently reported is that most people, as they're about to embark on a new incarnation, feel a deep sense of unease and actually don't want to do it, because they remember how awful and terrible and painful and challenging it could have been in the previous lives, and they don't necessarily want to go through the experience again. And we're told that some people do actively resist it until they're given a kick up the behind and told, you have to do this. It's your time to incarnate now. So it seems there are an awful lot of misunderstandings about this. The Celts were interesting. They used to celebrate the fact that people had died, and they used to mourn the fact that people were born, because they knew they were being born into a difficult life. So they had the opposite take on things to what we tend to do today.
I mean, the Vikings also, they had hardly any fear of death, because they were thinking they would go to Valhalla, and there were these fearless warriors. They were gladly dying on the battlefield as well. So yeah, from what you're saying, so the fear of death is really unfounded, and there shouldn't be any fear. Okay, so
well, I think that yeah.
Yeah, no, go on.
One of the things that motivates me about studying death, and some of my materialistic friends, they say, oh, you're very morbid, why do you do this stuff all the time? And I look on it as an important side project, maybe not even a side project, maybe even the main project, to take the fear out of death. Because a lot of people go through life being absolutely terrified about it. If you go to a dinner party and you suddenly start talking about death, well, that's the ultimate conversation stopper. People say, you're morbid, why are you thinking about death? It's never going to happen, just forget about it. Once you're dead, that's it, there's nothing further. And I want to try and change people's attitudes, because I think that if people have a different attitude to death, people have a different attitude to life. And once this kind of attitude becomes adopted, it could transform the world at a stroke. People would stop being as selfish as they are. They would become less materialistic. They would start to look on the fact that they are part of something much bigger than themselves, and that their conduct and their morality and their ethics are absolutely crucial. Otherwise, they're going to get a very bad time at some point in the future. So it's enlightened self-interest to believe that death is not the end. Death is not annihilation. Death is not oblivion. Death is not the final withdrawal of consciousness.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope.
Yeah, so do I. I'm a bit running out of questions now, but maybe it's more like what you would like to say now. I mean, I've kind of covered a lot of different things already from my questions, but maybe we take a moment, and if there's anything that is important to you to share about this, anything you would like people to know, or something you would like to share. Maybe you would like to talk about what you found out when you wrote your book, which will come out soon. That would be a possibility for you now.
Yes, I think one of the things that particularly interests me, my previous book was called Cycles of Eternity, and it looked, as it suggests, how things rise and fall. Everything in the world, from an atom to a galaxy, undergoes a particular cycle. Very long ones, very short ones. Some last less than a second, others last trillions of years. And this cycle involves birth, growth, maturity, decline, death, rest. And it repeats itself for everything. One of the things I found very interesting about this is how, when you look at civilizations, be they the old ones that the Theosophists talk about, like Lemuria and Atlantis, whether you look at Egypt or Rome or Greece or Phoenicia or the Maya or any civilization in Africa or any other continent, they all go through particular cycles. I'm very interested in watching a lot of these documentaries about sacred places on the television, and it interests me why places like Angkor Wat and Machu Picchu and other places are suddenly abandoned. They spend hundreds of years building up these fantastic buildings, and then suddenly, for whatever reason, they become abandoned. Some civilizations last for a very long time, such as Egypt, even though Egypt was invaded 16 or 17 times during that time, the Egyptian civilization with outside influences persisted. The Greek civilization had a very, very powerful influence for a short time, but then declined very rapidly, as did the Roman Empire. By the time you get to the 3rd or 4th century, it's just become so politically corrupt, so hedonistic, so out of touch with reality that it becomes inevitable that it declines. So it's not just we as individuals who reincarnate, it's whole civilizations. One of the interesting ideas I came across was that people who had spent time in Greece tended to reincarnate in France. Greece had a love of aesthetics, of beauty, of music, of love, the way that many French people do. Whereas the Romans, who were much more meticulous, wanted to make laws, impose order, would sacrifice beauty to functionality. Those people tended to be born in places like Germany and the UK. Obviously, not everyone from Greece wound up in France, not everybody from the Roman Empire ended up in Germany and the UK. But it's almost like particular tendencies of a civilization get replicated somewhere down the line. If you read the work of Edgar Cayce, the man known as the Sleeping Prophet, and he made thousands and thousands of predictions, and many of these were to do with Atlantis. And I think around about half the people who consulted him for readings, he said had spent time in Atlantis. And he said that if Atlantis made all these mistakes, Atlantean civilization is said to have bifurcated into two groups, basically the good, nice people and those, the lords of the dark face, who wanted to manipulate matter, who were into greed and pomp and splendor, and developed into two warring factions. And eventually their technology ultimately defeated them in perhaps a way that our own technology may defeat us at some point in the future. But Cayce said that if all these people, if half the people that he was consulting had had lives in Atlantis, then it would be inevitable that they would replicate some or all of those mistakes in the current civilization. And I do think there's some evidence for that. In fact, I think there's very persuasive evidence for that.
And maybe that's why it's so important to have the awareness of Atlantis and the mistakes that were made at this moment in time, not to repeat. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah. So much, Tim, for giving me your time. And good luck with the book.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. And just give me a call if you need anything else at all.
Thank you so much. That's great.
Bye-bye.
Have a good day. Bye-bye.